Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I am your host, and we have with us today Dr. Steve Turley. This brother's written over 20 books. I'm doing good to read 20 books in 2 years, much less be able to write 20 books over the span of my lifetime. And he has his website, turleytalks.com, and a podcast called Turley Talks. So listeners, please, if you want to learn more about him and his views on things, please go to his website and you'll learn about his books. And I think he's got some articles on there too in his podcast. Dr. Turley, thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
It's great to be with you, Corbin. Thank you so much for having me. Very much appreciate it.
We only do about 15, 20 minutes here. So I'm going to jump right into two questions.
Okay.
Two questions I think is very important for my listeners to have an answer to. The two questions are, what is critical race theory? How do you define it? And what is cultural Marxism? How do you define it?
All right. So critical race theory is the notion that society, all societies, but obviously Western society is the one that tends to be focused on, operate by power discrepancies. There is a dominant power population, and then there is a dominated population. And the dominant population is considered very bad because by its nature, it oppresses. By its nature, it induces laws and legal codes and political systems that protect its positions of power and domination. And then the vast majority of the rest of the society, they're all victims of this domination. And now, if this sounds like Marxism, that's precisely because it is, but it has a little bit of a twist. And while Marx would have defined the difference between the dominating group and the dominated group in terms of class and economics, critical race theorists define the distinction in terms of race. And so you know which group you're a part of based on your race. And it's very interesting because if that's the structure, and if the dominating group by definition is always bad, then it really doesn't matter how many individual good persons there were. There may have been abolitionists in that group, as there of course were. There may have been very good people, but the group itself is bad, and that's the way they need to be seen. Hence why we saw during the BLM riots over last summer, we saw actually abolitionists that we saw well, this kind of breaks the mold, but we even saw Frederick Douglass statue torn down and thrown into a ravine. I mean, it was utterly absurd and insane. Whereas it works similarly, but in an inverted sense, in the other way, the dominated group is always good, even if individuals in there are less to be desired or bad. It doesn't matter. When they act badly, they're acting out a natural response to the societal repression. And so you're already getting a sense of what the cultural Marxism is there. Cultural Marxism is different than economic Marxism in that the bourgeois and the proletariat aren't defined so much in class terms. They're defined more in cultural terms, because from theorists like Antonio Gramsci, this Italian Marxist, onward, specifically the Frankfurt School, they began to think and recognize, wait a minute, class and economics, those are all extensions of culture. And so the real point of discrepancy is the culture itself. And they really ultimately, like Marx himself, wanted to get rid of Western civilization, Western culture, everything that came before it, most especially the Christian faith. And they wanted to replace it with a new society that they thought would be a truly just and equitable society, reorganized around Marxist norms.
Yeah. When you had said that, as you're talking about critical race theory, defining it for us, and you say, oh, this might sound like Marxism to you. I was not in an agreement with you because I myself used to be a former Marxist.
Oh, there you go. There you are. Yeah.
So when I heard this, I was saying, hey, I left the revolution too soon. And then when you said about Antonio Gramsci, I was taught about him in cultural Marxism by one of the nation's leading Marxist scholars in this country.
Wow.
So when I hear these things, I say to folks all the time, they know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
You got to listen to them. They'll listen to Dr. Turley, I'm telling you.
Well, and for you, it's not theory. I mean, you were really there. You were imbibing it, and
you better believe it, brother. Let's talk a little bit here about Gwen Berry. This is this young lady who turned her back on the flag as she was accepting some type of position or something on the U.S. second Olympic team.
Yeah. And
then you even in this article you did, I forgot where it was published, but you talked about Jalen Rose. Made some pretty interesting comments. So run with that, brother.
It's fascinating stuff. So what you heard from both Gwen Berry and Jalen Rose, literally within a 24-hour period, were radically ethnocentric comments. So Gwen Berry, of course, as you pointed out, turned her back on the flag. She said she was actually, quote, pissed that they were playing the national anthem when she was getting her third place award or bronze medal after placing on the Olympic team. I mean, you would think this is the most amazing celebration of the most extraordinary opportunity an athlete could ever dream of having. Right. And she uses an opportunity to basically, thumb her nose at a flag and at the nation that it represents. And when she was asked, how could you do that? She doubled down on it. And in the end, she said she made a comment about the third verse of the national anthem as being racist, which it's not. What we find with historians of it, putting it in its proper historical context, it's not. But she had, I guess, gotten this notion somewhere that it was talking about slaves' blood being poured out on the floor on behalf of slave owners. It was, but then she said, how can I stand there when I have so much love for, and it was key, it was my people. I stand up for my people. And this national anthem was an offense to my people. And then right around the same time, Jalen Rose, the ESPN commentator, very famous athlete in his own right, actually excoriated the Olympic basketball team for taking the lone white guy on their Kevin Love. And he called him a token white guy because they just didn't have the guts to send an all black U.S. basketball team to the Olympics. And, obviously, if you just, and I know Candace Owens has done this on Twitter, if you just replace the term black or in this case, the term white for Kevin Love, or Gwen Berry talking about my people, if you had someone like Trump saying that about white people, I mean, it would, the explosion of racial, insensitivity would have been beyond words, and yet it's allowed, and that's part of a Marxist reconfiguring of life. It's actually known as repressive tolerance. I get into it a little bit in the article. It comes from the Frankfurt School. I'm sure you heard with Herbert Marcuse and all. And your listeners can actually read on it. It's very, it's open, it's out there. If they just look Marcuse, Marcuse, and they punch in repressive tolerance or just tolerance itself, they'll come up with the kind of the standard article. It was authored, if I recall, in the late 50s, early 60s. And the basic argument is you can overthrow the dominant culture of a society, which he was understanding in ethnic terms. You can do it by creating what he called a coalition of the aggrieved. And the coalition of aggrieved are ethnic minorities, but also sexual minorities, gender minorities, what have you. Anybody who who wasn't sharing equally in the power distribution. If you create a big enough coalition of the aggrieved, you'll be able to overthrow the dominant ethnicity. And the way you could prime society for that is through repressive tolerance. Anything that the minority cultures say by definition is good and should be allowed, because no matter what they say, it's an expression of their domination and repression. Whereas anything the dominant culture has to say, what he called the conservative culture, that's to be rejected. That's to be pushed back against as an expression of privilege. So I think what we're doing is we're seeing sort of this asymmetrical application of ethnocentricity, where someone like Gwen or Jalen Rose are allowed to speak in ethnic and racial terms that whites simply aren't allowed to do. And I'm sure you're familiar with Carol Swain, the Vanderbilt Princeton scholar, brilliant woman. She caught this all the way back in 2002, 20 years ago, in her studies, where she recognized that this was in effect balkanizing our society and giving rise to what she called a whole new generation of white nationalists who were not motivated by any kind of biological racism or social Darwinism like the KKK of old. They were actually being animated by this sense of unfairness and inequality, where these groups of people get to be as ethnocentric as they want. But then when I want to be ethnocentric and talk about the pride I have in my skin color, I'm suddenly told I can't do that. I'm racist, I'm bigoted, and I have to be a sovereign individual. And that kind of repressive tolerance, I think, has reached its climax, as it were, with CRT.
Brothers, you were talking, I guess speaking as a Black man, the one thing that sort of hit me, what bothers me, is that it seems as if they, from my standpoint, they've lowered standards for Black folk. It's like they expect lower standards for Black folk. They accept lower standards for Black folk. And that came up in a conversation where I was talking to a buddy of mine, and he said, Corbin, it bothers me to no end that someone like, I forgot that brother's name, George Floyd, is a hero. And I said, daggone it, man, I was raised on Medgar Evers. I was raised on Walter White, Whitney M. Young. And you're right, Rosa Parks. Those are our standards.
Right.
Now we've got this guy who's a criminal, career criminal, and he's now the hero. And it's like, not only is this sort of, and I just want your response to this lengthy little tirade. Not only are we getting this, Black folk are accepting this low standard. We're accepting this low standard, and that's one thing that really bothers me. You have someone from Black Lives Matter who stand up there and say, "Go ahead and loot these buildings. They have insurance on them."
Right.
Whereas, when there were at the King Jr. assassination, we had some of our people like James Brown and others. Hey, no, not about burn, baby, burn. It's about build, baby, build.
Build, right. The sense of virtue and civic virtue. That was a different time. We really did still have a sense of Christendom. It was still there. There was still a sense of civic virtue. Hence Martin Luther King could appeal to the Old Testament prophets as a basis for a gospel for all. And whereas, can you imagine somebody giving a speech like that now and people getting all the echoes of mountaintops, Isaiah 25 and the like? We're so biblically illiterate today, they wouldn't even understand it. No, you got it. David Horowitz has done a lot of writing on this. He was, of course, raised by Marxists. His family, his parents were Marxist activists on a compound. And he points out that Marxism, by definition, makes virtue of the victim. Wow. Marxism makes virtue of the victim. The victim is now the virtuous. And ironically, if you and I started talking about civic virtue, we would be accused of, this basic cultural domination, because civic virtue, according to CRT terms, or getting into the critical legal terms from which it comes from, is just a cloak. It's just a chimera for pushing bourgeois values, So, Yeah, it's really sad. And what it's doing to civic virtue is obviously embodied in what happened to our cities over the course of the summer. It's self-immolation. It's burning itself up, which ironically is the ultimate form of protest, isn't it? You know, you think of the monk, you know, who starts burning himself in a town square to protest some war or something like that. It's like it's self-immolation is the ultimate act of protest, and Marxism enshrined protest as the ultimate virtuous act. And it doesn't matter who's doing it as long as you are expressing oppression. So it's funny because what you have with repressive tolerance, I thought the whole Gina Carano thing was so fascinating. Or of course, Black conservatism has faced this constantly, is the moment you refuse to be a victim, you are suddenly expunged from the coalition of the aggrieved. So Gina Carano just being one of the more recent ones, she's a woman, so in terms of power structures, she's supposed to be one of the minorities. So then anything she says, by definition, is supposed to be allowed, right? No, except when you start sounding like the dominant power group, then you're cast out. In other words, you're only allowed in this coalition of the aggrieved if you agree to subsume yourself to a permanent status of victimhood. And how can people ever do something like that? You exalt victimhood to the highest level of virtue. And then the most absurd expressions of that are Meghan Markle and Oprah Winfrey. the most privileged people on the planet are trying to portray themselves as victims.
Yeah. I would say something about Oprah. I love Oprah. She loves me. She just don't know it, man. Trying to make me jealous with studying it. It ain't working. Call me, baby. Let's get together.
That's a big bank account, Corbin.
Hey, brother. Yeah. So, look, brother, let me. We're going to have to finish up a little bit, but before we do, though, how did you get into this? What's your quick story there? 20 books, brother. You're active, but you're showing some commitment there. What's going on with you? How'd you get involved in this?
Well, I was doing doctoral studies out at the University of Durham, which is in the UK, and I came across a field of study called post-secular studies. I couldn't believe it, actually, when I found it was back in 2008. And the basic argument of post-secular scholars, and it's actually a very huge, wide swath of studies. So you get post-secular law, post-secular fashion, post-secular international relations, really fascinating stuff. But the basic argument is that the secular world is dying. The secular world has basically depleted itself. It's trying to find solutions that to problems it itself is creating. And so modern secularism is dying, and more cultures are going back, or populations are going back to culture and custom and tradition. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so much ethnocentricity today, and what Michel Mafusoli referred to as neo-tribalism. He predicted that back in the 1970s and 80s, that as the modern secular world begins to erode, you're going to see a resurgence of religion for sure, which we are. And you're going to see a resurgence of what he called tribalism, which is people going back to their ethnic and racial allegiances. We saw that in its violent outworkings, obviously, in Rwanda and the Balkans and the like. And we're seeing it working itself out politically, I think, here in the States with Black Lives Matter and La Raza, the new white nationalism, and so on. And what post-secular scholarship basically said, the promise was that many populations are actually just going back to simple national sovereignty, and they're done with the globalist structures, the globalist world, and they want to return to sovereign expressions such as border security and economic security, and celebrating their cultures, their customs and traditions, rather than denigrating them as bigoted and all kinds of phobic and the like. And I have to say, I didn't really believe it. I knew it was happening in Russia. I knew it was happening in India. I knew it was happening in Africa, and Middle East, but the West, forget it. And then I'll never forget June 23rd, 2016, Brexit. More Brits voted to leave the EU than had ever voted for a politician or political party before. A few months later, Donald Trump. And all of a sudden, I started to see all the things these scholars, these post-secular scholars, were arguing. I started to see it actually happening. The globalist, kind of modernist world was breaking up, and a new political order around national sovereignty and conservatism and traditionalism was emerging. And I said, I gotta tell people about this. So I ended up just throwing out as many books as I could, as quick as I could, to give people different angles of this post-secular world that's rising. And it's not without its difficulties. Obviously the question is, can we hold together in the midst of all this? It's going to be a big question over the next 10 years, no question. But by the same token, there's some exciting new possibilities as well.
Brother, it's a great way to conclude this. Again, I want to thank you. Speaking to my listeners, this is Dr. Steve Turley. You can learn more about him, pick up some of his books at turleytalks.com. And brother, I just want to thank you so much. Hope we can have you come back sometime to talk about a few things, because man, there's all sorts of things happening in this country, man. You
it sure is.
Breath and wait 3 minutes and boom, something new's coming up. It's
That's
amazing.
right.
It's absolutely amazing.
I'd love to, Corbin. Thank you so much for having me on the channel.
Thank you, brother.